On a windy April afternoon, his entire stage shrank to the size of a wooden table and a glass of water. From that minimalist space, he began to tell his own story, turning anxieties, obsessions, and the most trivial details into a mesmerizing art form. The audience would laugh at his awkwardness, then fall silent as they realized he was shining a light into the deepest corners of their own souls. But the wind that afternoon blew across a shattered soul. Ever since the accident, the very brain that had once woven so many stories had become a prison with no escape, a place where his own narratives became distorted echoes that tormented him. The artist who had spent his life laying bare the naked truth was now imprisoned by a truth that was silent and brutal. He, who had once been the omnipotent author of his own life story, found the final chapter ripped out by a cruel twist of fate, leaving only blank pages stained with pain. A story that could not be continued, only ended. To understand Spalding Gray, you have to understand the world he was born into, a world of manicured lawns, quiet desperation, and unspoken truths. He was a product of post-war America, specifically the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, or WASP, enclave of Barrington, Rhode Island. Born in 1941, he grew up in the seemingly placid 1950s, an era of Eisenhower prosperity and nuclear family ideals. On the surface, it was a world of order, propriety, and emotional restraint. Feelings, especially messy, complicated ones, were things to be managed, controlled, and preferably kept behind closed doors. The Gray family home was a perfect embodiment of this ethos. His father was a factory treasurer, a practical, stoic man who represented the solid, unshakable bedrock of New England tradition. His mother, a homemaker, was a more complicated figure, a woman whose inner turmoil simmered just beneath the surface of suburban domesticity. This was the American landscape that the beat writers like Jack Kerouac were rebelling against, a culture of conformity they saw as spiritually deadening. For a sensitive, observant boy like Spalding, this environment was both a source of comfort and a gilded cage. He was steeped in a culture where what you didn't say was often more important than what you did. The pressure to conform, to be a good boy, was immense. Yet bubbling underneath this veneer of calm was a sea of anxiety. The Cold War raged. The threat of nuclear annihilation was a constant low-grade hum in the background of daily life. And a generation of young people was beginning to question the values their parents had fought a world war to preserve. It was a world teetering on the edge of a massive cultural shift. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum, and the folk music revival was giving voice to a new kind of social consciousness. By the time Spalding went to college in the early 1960s, the first tremors of the counterculture earthquake were being felt. This clash between the buttoned-down world of his upbringing and the explosive let-it-all-hang-out ethos of the 1960s would become the central tension of his life and his art. He was a man with a 1950s psyche trapped in a 1960s world, and the friction between those two poles would generate the creative spark that defined his career. His work would become a lifelong attempt to unpack and articulate the very things his childhood had taught him to suppress, turning the unspoken anxieties of the American WASP into a public confession. The story of Spalding Gray is a story of ghosts, and the most significant and terrifying of these was his mother, Elizabeth. She was a woman who wrestled with a profound depression and what were then vaguely, shamefully understood as nervous problems or women's troubles. In the suffocating politeness of 1950s suburbia, there was no acceptable language for her suffering, no community support, no understanding that her condition was a medical one rather than a moral or personal failure. She was expected to be the cheerful, capable matriarch of the perfect family, and her inability to fulfill this role filled her with a sense of shame that only deepened her illness. In a desperate search for a framework to understand her unraveling mind, she eventually retreated into Christian Science. The faith, founded by Mary Baker Eddy, posits that sickness and suffering are fundamentally illusions of the material world, errors in thought that can be overcome by prayer and a spiritual understanding of God's perfection. For Elizabeth, it was a tragic paradox, a belief system that promised to heal her by insisting that her immense pain wasn't real. It was a last-ditch attempt to find a non-medical spiritual solution for a biological storm raging within her brain. For a young Spalding, his mother's decline was a terrifying, bewildering ordeal that unfolded in hushed tones and closed-door conversations. He watched the vibrant, intelligent woman he knew slowly disappear, consumed by an invisible force that no one in the family dared to name. He would later recall moments of bizarre behavior, of deep, inexplicable sadness followed by periods of frantic, almost manic energy. He was witnessing the classic brutal cycles of what was likely undiagnosed bipolar disorder, but without any context for it. All he knew was that his mother was slipping away, and the family's response was to tighten the silence, to pretend that nothing was wrong, to uphold the facade at all costs. This silence, this collective denial was perhaps as damaging as the illness itself. It taught him that the most frightening things in the world are the things we are forbidden to speak of. In 1967, at the age of 52, Elizabeth Gray drove the family car into the garage, closed the door, and turned on the engine. She left no note. Her suicide was the foundational trauma of Spalding's existence, the unexploded bomb at the very center of his emotional world. It shattered the family's carefully constructed veneer and left behind a legacy of guilt, confusion, and a terrible gnawing fear. For Spalding, it instilled a profound sense of inherited madness, a chilling terror that he was genetically doomed to follow the same dark path. He became convinced he carried her bad blood, and this fear would become a primary subject of his work, a ghost he would try to exorcise on stage, night after night, in front of crowds of strangers. "I think I've been talking to her ever since," he would later say. His entire career can be seen as a reaction to his mother's final, definitive silence, a desperate, lifelong attempt to talk about the unspeakable, to name the demon that had consumed her, in the hope that naming it would rob it of its power over him. After graduating from Emerson College with a degree in dramatic arts, Spalding fled the suffocating gentility of New England for the chaotic, liberating anonymity of New York City in the late 1960s. He was drawn not to Broadway, with its polished musicals and commercial aspirations, but to the city's burgeoning and radical downtown theater scene. This was off Broadway, a world of converted lofts in Soho, black box theaters in the East Village, and experimental collectives of artists who wanted to tear down the conventions of traditional text-based theater. It was a scene fueled by the political ferment of the era, the Vietnam War, the sexual revolution, the broader counterculture, and a desire to create new forms of performance that reflected a fractured, chaotic world. It was here, in this crucible of artistic innovation, that he found his tribe. In 1975, he co-founded the Wooster Group with his then partner, the formidable and visionary director, Elizabeth Lecomte. Operating out of their permanent home, the Performing Garage on Wooster Street, the group quickly became the bleeding edge of the American avant-garde. Their work was dense, challenging, deconstructed, and often intentionally bewildering. Lecomte's method was to take classic American texts, Thornton Wilder's Our Town, Arthur Miller's The Crucible, and shatter them, reassembling the pieces into provocative multimedia collages. They incorporated video, distorted sound, radical choreography, and a performance style that was emotionally detached and highly technical. The goal was not to tell a linear story, but to interrogate the text itself, to expose its underlying assumptions and cultural biases. For years, Spalding was a key actor within this collective, a cog in Lecomte's intricate and demanding theatrical machinery. He was praised for his stage presence and his willingness to submit to the group's rigorous, often grueling process. But he was growing restless. He felt a profound disconnect between the highly conceptual, intellectually cool nature of the work and his own burgeoning need for direct, personal, and emotional expression. He was tired of interpreting other people's words, tired of being an element in someone else's grand design. His head was filled with his own stories, his own anxieties, his own voice clamoring to be heard. The aesthetic of the Wooster Group was about deconstructing the self, while Spalding was becoming obsessed with constructing one. The epiphany came from a simple suggestion. One day, a friend listening to Spalding's endless looping stories of his life suggested he just sit down and tell them to an audience. It was a simple, almost naive idea, yet it felt radical. To dispense with character, with set, with plot, with everything that defined traditional theater, and to rely solely on the power of one's own life story. So he did. He arranged for a performance at the Performing Garage. He brought out a plain wooden desk and a chair. He placed a microphone, a glass of water, and a spiral notebook on the desk. And he began to talk. He talked about his childhood in Barrington, his anxieties, his awkward sexual encounters, the ghosts of his family. He wasn't acting. He was testifying. At first, these pieces, like his debut monologue, Sex and Death, to the age of 14, were performed in the small, intimate spaces of the downtown art scene for audiences of fellow artists and critics. But something extraordinary and unexpected began to happen. Audiences were utterly captivated. In an era of theatrical artifice and intellectual abstraction, the simple, vulnerable act of a man sitting at a desk and telling his own story with unflinching, often uncomfortable honesty was a revelation. He had found his voice, not in a character written by a playwright, but in the unadorned, neurotic, and deeply funny character of Spalding Gray. He was stripping away the layers of performance to get at something raw and real. He was turning his own life into his primary text, his consciousness into the stage. He was pioneering a new form of theater, one that blurred the lines between art and life, between confession and performance. The desk, the water, the notebook, they became his iconic stage props, the simple tools of a brand new trade, the autobiographical monologist. He had found a way to take the silence of Barrington and transform it into a symphony of words. Having forged his unique voice in the crucible of his family's unspoken traumas and the radical experimentation of the downtown theater scene, Spalding Gray had discovered his true medium. The man at the desk was born, a figure who could alchemize the quiet desperation of his Barrington past into captivating public art. But while he had mastered the telling of his own interior world, he remained a cult figure, a secret kept by the New York cognoscenti. The next chapter of his life would be defined by a collision with the world at large, when a chance encounter with history on a massive scale provided him with his greatest subject. The intimate stage of the self was about to expand dramatically, testing his personal anxieties against the backdrop of geopolitical horror and the absurdities of global fame. By the early 1980s, Spalding Gray had successfully carved out a unique and vital space for himself within the landscape of American theater. He was no longer just an actor in the avant-garde machinery of the Wooster Group. He was the sole proprietor of his own singular art form. From his perch behind a simple wooden desk, he had become a kind of public philosopher of the personal, a cartographer of his own psyche. His early monologues, such as Sex and Death to the Age of 14 and Booze, Cars, and College Girls, had established him as a cult figure in the downtown New York art scene. Audiences, weary of the intellectual coolness of postmodern performance, were drawn to the radical vulnerability and searing honesty of his work. He spoke the unspoken, transforming the mundane humiliations and private anxieties of his New England upbringing into hilarious, compelling, and universally resonant theater. He had found his voice, his method, and his audience, but he was still a niche artist, a secret whispered among the cognoscenti. The moment that would catapult him from the intimate confines of the performing garage to the glare of international recognition came from the most unlikely of sources: a small role in a big, serious Hollywood movie about one of the 20th century's darkest chapters. In 1983, through a series of fortunate connections, Gray was cast as the American ambassador's aide in Roland Joffé's harrowing historical drama, The Killing Fields. The film told the true story of Dith Pran, a Cambodian journalist, and Sidney Schanberg, his American colleague at the New York Times, during the brutal reign of the Khmer Rouge. The production was a massive undertaking, filmed primarily in Thailand, a country that bordered the still traumatized nation of Cambodia. For Spalding Gray, a man defined by his own meticulously cataloged internal landscape, being suddenly dropped into a real-world landscape of mass graves and historical trauma was a profoundly disorienting and creatively fertile experience. He was a creature of Soho lofts and Freudian analysis, now finding himself in the humid, chaotic, and spiritually charged environment of Southeast Asia, surrounded by the ghosts of a genocide. The experience was a collision of the profound and the profane. On one hand, he was confronted with the chilling, incomprehensible reality of the Cambodian genocide. He spoke with survivors, visited refugee camps, and absorbed the horrifying history of Pol Pot's Year Zero, a fanatical agrarian revolution that led to the deaths of nearly 2 million people through execution, starvation, and disease. The scale of the cruelty was beyond his intellectual grasp, a black hole of human depravity that challenged his every assumption about the world. On the other hand, he was a minor player in the absurd circus of a major motion picture production. He witnessed the vanities of actors, the anxieties of the director, and the logistical insanities of creating a fictional world in a real one. His own concerns were hilariously narcissistic and trivial in comparison to the subject matter of the film. He obsessed over his single, pivotal scene, fretted about the size of his per diem, and worried endlessly about getting the perfect haircut for his minor role, a quest that became a comic centerpiece in his telling. This jarring juxtaposition, the micro-anxieties of a neurotic actor set against the macro-horrors of history, became the raw material for his next and most famous monologue, Swimming to Cambodia. Premiering at the Performing Garage in November 1984, Swimming to Cambodia was his masterpiece, the work in which his unique theatrical form reached its full breathtaking potential. Performed over 2 consecutive nights, each part running nearly 2 hours, it was a virtuosic and intricate tapestry woven from 3 distinct threads. The first was the hilarious behind-the-scenes satire of the making of The Killing Fields. With pinpoint accuracy, he recounted the absurdities of Hollywood filmmaking, the endless waiting, the technical gaffes, the self-importance of the movie business clashing with the grim reality of its subject. He detailed his awkward interactions with the film's stars, Sam Waterston and Dr. Heng S. Ngor, a Cambodian physician and genocide survivor who would win an Academy Award for his portrayal of Dith Pran, and his own pathetic attempts to feel important on set. These stories were masterful pieces of comic storytelling, showcasing his genius for finding the universal in the specific, the hilarious in the humiliating. The second thread was his personal, almost spiritual quest for a perfect moment. Traumatized by the stories of Cambodia and overwhelmed by the sensory overload of Thailand, Gray sought refuge and transcendence in the ocean. He became obsessed with swimming long distances off the coast, a physical act that served as a metaphor for a deeper psychological journey. He described the beauty and terror of the sea, the feeling of being a tiny, insignificant speck in a vast, indifferent universe. His search for a moment of perfect oceanic bliss, a moment free from fear, from memory, from the chatter of his own mind, was a poignant and relatable expression of a universal human longing for peace. It was in these passages that his prose became most poetic, capturing the seductive pull of oblivion and the fleeting nature of grace. The third and most powerful thread was the chilling, unforgettable history of the Cambodian genocide. Gray did not present himself as an expert or a historian. Instead, he acted as a conduit, a horrified witness recounting what he had learned. He relayed the stories told to him by survivors, describing the Khmer Rouge's brutal methods with a quiet, devastating simplicity. He spoke of the evacuation of Phnom Penh, the separation of families, the torture, the starvation. One moment, he would have the audience roaring with laughter at a story about his neurotic fear of Thai prostitutes. The next, he would silence the room with a horrifying account of the Khmer Rouge's policy of executing anyone who wore eyeglasses because it marked them as an intellectual. The genius of the monologue was in how he seamlessly braided these disparate threads together. He didn't just alternate between comedy and horror, he showed how they were inextricably linked. He managed to connect his personal solipsistic anxieties with the vast impersonal horrors of history, suggesting, profoundly, that perhaps the chaos of the world was just a larger, more terrifying reflection of the chaos within ourselves. Swimming to Cambodia was a critical and commercial triumph. It won an Obie Award, the highest honor in off-Broadway theater, and moved to larger venues, playing to sold-out houses. Critics lauded it as a landmark piece of performance art. Frank Rich of the New York Times called him a talking poet of the psychopathology of our time. He had become, as another critic dubbed him, the wasp shaman, a man who processed the anxieties of his tribe and the traumas of the world through the public ritual of storytelling. In 1987, the monologue was adapted into a film directed by Jonathan Demme. Demme wisely chose not to open up the performance, but to focus intensely on Gray at his desk, using minimalist sound design, archival footage, and Laurie Anderson's haunting score to augment the power of the words. The film brought Gray's unique brand of neurotic narration to a mainstream international audience, cementing his status as one of the most original voices in American culture. He was no longer a downtown secret. He was a star. Fame, of course, brought with it a new set of anxieties, and therefore new material. His next major work, Monster in a Box, 1991, hilariously and anxiously detailed his struggles to complete his first and only novel, an autobiographical novel naturally, about the very experiences that had formed swimming to Cambodia. The monster of the title was the gigantic 1,800-page manuscript that sat in a box in his apartment, a physical manifestation of his inability to contain his own life within the traditional narrative structure of a book. The monologue was a brilliant and painfully funny meditation on procrastination, the fear of success, and the paralyzing nature of creative ambition. Having achieved the success he had long craved, he was now terrified by it. He feared being a one-hit wonder, an imposter who would be exposed as a fraud. The novel represented his attempt to legitimize himself as a real writer, but the project had become a source of torment, an albatross around his neck. Monster in a Box was, in many ways, his most relatable work for a certain creative class. He detailed his elaborate avoidance strategies, his sudden interest in skiing, his disastrous trip to Hollywood for a meeting with a slick agent who wanted to turn his life into a sitcom, his compulsive need to organize his closets rather than face the blank page. He wrestled with the central paradox of the autobiographical artist. How do you finish a story when you are still living it? How do you find an ending for a life that is still in progress? The monologue cemented his public persona as the neurotic intellectual, the artist wrestling not with grand abstract themes, but with the mundane, terrifying business of getting through the day and doing the work. It was a masterpiece of self-deprecation, a confession of creative impotence that was itself a triumph of creative potency. He followed this with Gray's Anatomy, 1993, a monologue that shifted the focus from professional anxiety to a far more primal fear, bodily decay and death. The piece chronicled his panicked journey through the labyrinth of both conventional and alternative medicine after being diagnosed with a rare ocular condition called a macular pucker, a small piece of scar tissue growing over the retina of his left eye, distorting his vision. For a man whose entire art form was based on observation, a threat to his eyesight was a threat to his very being. The recommended treatment was surgery, which for a world-class hypochondriac like Gray was an absolute nightmare. His terror of going under the knife sent him on a wild global odyssey in search of a cure. He consulted with sweat lodge gurus in the American Southwest, Christian Science practitioners who tried to convince him the pucker was an illusion, and, most memorably, a Filipino psychic surgeon who claimed to perform surgery with his bare hands. He traveled to see a nutritional ophthalmologist who prescribed a bizarre regimen of wheatgrass juice and other foul-concocting remedies. Again, he turned his private terror into sublime public comedy, transforming his hypochondria into a profound and hilarious exploration of our universal fear of mortality. The monologue explored our desperate search for a cure, not just for our bodies, but for our troubled minds. It was a sharp critique of the cold, impersonal nature of Western medicine, and a simultaneously skeptical and hopeful look at the world of alternative healing. Through it all, he was really asking a fundamental question. In the face of our inevitable physical decline, where do we place our faith? In science and spirituality in ourselves? Through the 1980s and into the mid-1990s, Spalding Gray was more than just a performer. He was a cultural touchstone. He appeared in films like Beaches and David Byrne's True Stories, and on television shows like The Nanny, always exuding that unique, articulate, and perpetually worried Spalding Grayness. To his devoted audience, he seemed to be a man who had figured out the ultimate trick, how to tame his demons by putting them on public display, how to master his anxiety by making it his life's work. It seemed like a perfect, sustainable system. He had created a feedback loop where his life produced the material for his art, and his art gave his life a sense of meaning and control. But the system was far more fragile than anyone, perhaps even Gray himself, truly knew. The man at the desk, so seemingly in command of his own narrative, was wrestling with forces far older and deeper than a book he couldn't finish or a problem with his eye. With the international success of Swimming to Cambodia and his subsequent monologues, the persona of Spalding Gray was solidified in the public imagination. He was the WASP shaman, the solitary figure at the desk who had mastered his own narrative and, in doing so, articulated the neuroses of a generation. The world saw a man alone, seemingly in complete control of the stories he chose to tell, but a performance built so explicitly on the foundation of a real life is never a truly solo act. To understand the man behind the monologue, one must look beyond the desk and into the complex, often fraught private relationships that fueled the work, the collaborations, conflicts, and loves that were the raw, unedited material from which the polished public confessions were mined. For all the public confession and unflinching self-exposure that defined his art, the core of Spalding Gray's life was a series of intensely private, often turbulent, and creatively essential relationships. While his monologues presented a man alone at a desk, seemingly a solitary narrator of his own existence, his life off stage was a dynamic interplay with powerful, intelligent women who were not merely subjects of his stories, but active participants and shapers of his world. His narrative of self was never created in a vacuum. It was forged in the crucible of love, conflict, and collaboration. His 20-year partnership with Elizabeth Lecomte was the bedrock of his early creative life and the defining relationship of his formative years as an artist. They met in the late 1960s, two ambitious, fiercely intelligent individuals drawn to the radical possibilities of experimental theater. Lecomte was, and remains, a formidable and visionary director, the intellectual powerhouse and uncompromising aesthetic force behind the Wooster Group. He was the performer, the raw material, the charismatic but often chaotic presence she molded within her intricate theatrical compositions. Their relationship was a complete fusion of the personal and the professional, a dynamic that was both creatively explosive and emotionally taxing. Their life at the performing garage was all-consuming. There was no boundary between the work and their shared existence. Their arguments would become material, their psychological battles informing the deconstructed texts they staged. This intense symbiosis was creatively fruitful for years, but for Spalding, it eventually became untenable. While Lecomte's artistic project was to deconstruct and depersonalize, to take apart narratives and expose the mechanics of performance, Spalding's impulse was the opposite. He was driven by a burgeoning need to construct a narrative, to synthesize his experiences, to place his authentic, subjective self at the very center of the stage. When he broke away to pursue his monologues in earnest, it was not just an artistic choice, but a profound personal declaration of independence. He needed to be the sole author of his own story, free from the deconstructive and, at times, emotionally brutal lens of the collective he had helped to create. Their separation was both an artistic and a romantic divorce, a painful tearing of a fabric woven over 2 decades. He had stepped out from behind the complex machinery of the Wooster Group to sit alone at his desk, but the ghost of that first formative partnership would always inform the voice he found there. After his relationship with Lecomte ended, he began a long-term partnership with Renee Shafransky, an artist and writer who would become both his collaborator and, to a significant degree, his subject. Their relationship coincided with his ascent to fame following Swimming to Cambodia. Shafransky co-produced and helped edit several of his monologue films, including Monster in a Box, and provided a crucial intellectual and emotional sounding board for his work. He, in turn, chronicled their life together in his performances, particularly in the monologue, It's a Slippery Slope. He laid their private life bare on stage, their travels, their arguments, his deep-seated ambivalence about commitment and marriage, their shared anxieties. To be in a relationship with Spalding Gray was to accept that your life together was potential material, that the most intimate moments could be curated, shaped, and presented to a paying audience. This was the central, exhilarating, and often painful paradox of being close to him. In a poignant essay titled Spalding's Last Interview, published after his death, Shafransky grappled with this complex reality. She described the experience of being a character in the ongoing story of Spalding Gray, a story over which she had no editorial control. Spalding believed in a hierarchy of truth, she wrote, with the real story being the one told by the artist. He took from life what he needed. He was the hero of all his stories. It was a feeling she likened to being an animal in a cage with a friendly lion who might suddenly turn and eat you. Her observation was not an accusation of malice, but a deeply insightful comment on the inherent narcissism of the autobiographical artist. His art depended on mining the intimacy of his life, but that mining could feel like a violation, a betrayal, to those who shared that life with him. His profound need to narrate, to turn every experience into a story, often blurred the line between living his life and performing it, leaving those closest to him to wonder where the man ended and the character began. Throughout these relationships, his deepest and most persistent anxieties remained rooted in his own family history. The ghost of his mother, Elizabeth, was a constant, haunting presence. He was terrified of what he called bad blood, a lurking genetic predisposition to the mental illness that had claimed her. This terror manifested as a lifelong struggle with depression, which he often personified as his shadow, a dark companion that walked beside him. He tried everything to outrun it. Years of Freudian psychoanalysis, EST, Erhard seminars training, Eastern philosophy, Rolfing, a form of deep tissue massage, and, of course, the talking cure he administered to himself on stage. The monologues were a form of public self-therapy, a heroic attempt to map the geography of his own mind, to locate the source of the darkness, and to contain it through the power of articulation. At a time when such confessions were far less common, he spoke with startling frankness about his depression and his therapy, humanizing a struggle that millions suffered in shame-filled silence. His audience felt a profound connection to this vulnerability. He was giving them a language for their own shadows. In the mid-1990s, a significant shift occurred in his life. He met Kathy Russo, and after a courtship that was, naturally, filled with the ambivalence and neurotic second-guessing that fueled his work, they married. For the first time at the age of 52, he became a father. He and Russo had 2 sons, Forrest and Theo, and he became a stepfather to her daughter from a previous relationship, Marissa. This descent into domesticity both terrified and transformed him. Fatherhood, in particular, grounded him in a new and profound way, forcing him to confront his deep-seated fears of responsibility, his own mortality, and the terrifying possibility of passing his bad blood on to his children. He chronicled this dramatic life change in what would become one of his most personal and moving monologues, It's a Slippery Slope, 1996. The central metaphor of the piece was his decision to learn how to ski late in life, a clumsy, exhilarating, and terrifying endeavor that mirrored his plunge into marriage and fatherhood. Skiing, for him, was a confrontation with his own lack of control, his fear of falling, his resistance to surrendering to gravity's pull. It was the perfect metaphor for a man who had spent his life trying to control everything through language, now faced with the beautiful, messy, and uncontrollable realities of family life. For a time, it seemed as if he had finally found a kind of peace, a version of the perfect moment he had chased on Thai beaches. But this time, it was located in the mundane realities of changing diapers, school runs, and family dinners. He and his family settled in Sag Harbor, a historic village on Long Island, a world away from the gritty, avant-garde downtown scene where he'd made his name. He had a family, a home with a yard, and a measure of the stability he had spent his entire life both craving and resisting. He was still Spalding Gray, the neurotic storyteller, but the stories were changing. They were less about the solitary, narcissistic self navigating a chaotic world, and more about the self in relation to others, as a husband, as a father. It was a quieter, more mature voice. It seemed for a brief, hopeful period, as if the talking cure had finally truly worked. It seemed as if he had built a life sturdy enough to keep the shadows at bay. Through the turbulent terrain of his relationships, Spalding Gray had finally arrived at a destination he had spent a lifetime both seeking and fleeing: a stable domestic life. As a husband and father living in the quiet seaside town of Sag Harbor, it seemed as if the restless, anxious seeker had found an anchor. The monologues were becoming less about the solitary self and more about the self in relation to others, suggesting a man who had perhaps made a fragile peace with the ghosts of his past. But a life's narrative is not solely authored by the person living it. No fortress of words, no matter how brilliantly constructed, can protect against the brute, physical randomness of the world. A single catastrophic moment on a country road was about to prove that the most terrifying stories are the ones that happen without metaphor, the ones that shatter the storyteller himself. The fragile peace that Spalding Gray had meticulously constructed in the quiet domestic world of Sag Harbor was a testament to a life spent wrestling with chaos. The house, the marriage, the children, they were the tangible structures of a hard-won stability, an anchor in the turbulent waters of his own psyche. For a time it seemed he had finally outrun the ghost of his mother and quieted the anxious chatter in his own mind. He was no longer just the solitary man at the desk narrating his alienation. He was a man embedded in the messy, beautiful fabric of a family. This new chapter of his life, a life he had both craved and resisted for so long, deserved a celebration. And so in the early summer of 2001, he and his wife, Kathy Russo, traveled to Ireland to celebrate his 60th birthday. It was meant to be a joyful milestone, a trip to a land of words and myths that was a fitting place for a master storyteller to mark his passage into a new decade. On a bright, sunny afternoon in June, they were driving down a narrow, winding country road, the kind that crisscrosses the Irish landscape, lined with ancient stone walls and impossibly green fields. It was a scene of pastoral beauty, the very picture of tranquility. And then, in an instant of inexplicable random violence, another car swerved into their lane. The head-on collision was horrific. In that single sickening crunch of metal and shattering glass, the narrative of Spalding Gray's life was irrevocably broken. The crash was devastating for both of them. Kathy suffered serious injuries, a long and painful ordeal in itself. But Spalding's injuries were catastrophic. He sustained a badly fractured right hip, which would leave him in chronic, debilitating pain for the rest of his life. And, most critically, he suffered a depressed skull fracture on the right side of his head. A piece of his own skull, was driven inward, bruising and permanently damaging his brain. Specifically, the injury was to his right frontal lobe, the part of the brain that governs personality, emotional regulation, impulse control, and the ability to plan and make sense of the world. The man who returned from Ireland was not the same man who had left. The physical change was stark. The limp, the cane, the constant grinding pain from his shattered hip. But the psychological and neurological damage was far more profound and terrifying. His vibrant, agile mind, the very instrument of his art, his livelihood, and his being, was broken. He fell into a deep, intractable depression, a darkness far more profound and suffocating than the familiar shadow he had so eloquently chronicled and wrestled with his entire life. This was not the poetic melancholy he could shape into a monologue, the existential angst that could be mined for insight and ironic humor. This was a crushing biological reality, a chemical and structural prison from which there was no escape. His friends and family watched in horror as the man they knew began to disappear. The witty, articulate, endlessly curious storyteller was replaced by a man tormented by a flat, colorless anguish. He was unable to find joy or pleasure in anything. He became obsessive, trapped in a neurological loop, replaying the accident over and over in his mind, describing it in gruesome detail to anyone who would listen. The trauma had become his entire world, blotting out everything else. The complex, delicate machinery that had allowed him to alchemize pain into art, to transform suffering into narrative, had been smashed. He tried heroically to do the only thing he knew how to do, turn the experience into a story. He began working on a new monologue, tentatively titled Black Spot, after the ominous summons from Treasure Island. He intended for it to be the story of the accident and his agonizing recovery, but the words wouldn't come. His ability to create a narrative, to find a shape, a meaning, a beginning, middle, and end in the chaos, had deserted him. The injury to his frontal lobe had stolen his capacity for abstraction, for finding the ironic distance or the philosophical absurdity in his own suffering. For a man whose entire identity was built on the act of talking his way through his troubles, this was the ultimate horror. He was left with the raw, unprocessed pain, but without the tools to give it form. There was nothing funny about it. There was nothing enlightening about it. There was only the abyss. He sought help with a desperate urgency. He tried a staggering array of antidepressants and mood stabilizers, but the medication seemed to have little effect. He underwent multiple rounds of electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, a treatment of last resort for severe depression, which brought only fleeting temporary relief, if any. He even considered radical brain surgery, clinging to the hope of a physical fix for a wound that seemed beyond all other remedies. Nothing worked. In the 2.5 years between the accident and his death, Spalding's life became a painful cycle of despair and fleeting hope. He made several suicide attempts, each one a more desperate cry from a mind in unrelenting torment. The fear that had haunted him his entire life, that he would end up like his mother, was no longer a shadowy premonition, but a consuming daily reality. He spoke openly and with a chilling lucidity of his desire to die. He told friends and family that he felt he was an unbearable burden, that the physical and mental pain was simply too much to bear, and that his life as he had known it was over. On January 10, 2004, a Saturday, he took his 2 young sons, Forrest and Theo, to see a movie in Manhattan. The film was Tim Burton's Big Fish, a poignant, fantastical tale about a dying father who has told embellished, mythic stories about his life and his estranged son's attempt to separate the fact from the fiction. After the movie, he had a brief final conversation with his stepdaughter, Marissa. Then, he went to the South Ferry terminal and bought a ticket for the Staten Island ferry. He was reported missing that night. For nearly 2 agonizing months, his family and friends waited in an agony of uncertainty, clinging to the slimmest of hopes while bracing for the worst. The city was plastered with missing person flyers bearing his familiar anxious face. The story of his disappearance became a media obsession, a tragic public coda to a life lived in the public eye. Finally, on March 7th, 2004, his body was identified after being pulled from the East River near Greenpoint, Brooklyn, by 2 men working on a ferry boat. The New York City medical examiner determined the cause of death was suicide by drowning. The man of a million words, the master of the monologue, had been consumed by a final terrible silence. The final terrible silence of Spalding Gray's death marked the brutal, unambiguous end to the narrative of his life. The man who had lived by words was consumed by a pain for which he had none. The story was over. Yet the end of a life is often the beginning of a legacy. His tragic departure left behind a body of work that now had to be re-examined through the lens of its conclusion. It forced a series of profound and difficult questions that continue to resonate about the nature of truth in art, the responsibility of the autobiographical storyteller, and the devastating reality of mental illness and traumatic brain injury. To understand his ultimate importance, one must look at the indelible mark he left behind and the crucial conversations his life and his death compelled us to have. Spalding Gray's death cast a long, sorrowful shadow over the cultural landscape. It was not just the loss of a singular, brilliant voice, but the tragic conclusion to a story that many had followed for decades. For his audience who felt they knew him with an unusual intimacy, his suicide felt like a personal blow, a devastating final chapter that retroactively colored everything that had come before. In the aftermath, as friends, family, critics, and fans tried to make sense of the tragedy, the conversations that had always surrounded his work took on a new, more urgent poignancy. Chief among these was the fundamental question of truth. Was he a journalist of the self, delivering factual, unvarnished reports from the front lines of his own life? Or was he a masterful fiction writer whose greatest and most enduring character was the neurotic, articulate, and perpetually seeking man named Spalding Gray? He himself offered a useful, if ambiguous term for his method, poetic reporting. The phrase is a telling one, a deliberate fusion of 2 seemingly contradictory impulses, the objective truth-telling of journalism and the subjective, evocative artistry of poetry. It acknowledges the artistic shaping, the selection, and the embellishment inherent in the act of turning lived experience into performance. Spalding didn't work from a verbatim transcript of his life. He didn't carry a tape recorder to document his conversations or a notepad to jot down events as they happened. He worked from memory, which is by its very nature a reconstructive, fallible, and deeply personal narrative-building process. In his spiral notebooks, he would write outlines, key phrases, and thematic signposts, but the performances themselves were largely extemporaneous, recreated anew each night. Details would shift, timelines might be compressed for dramatic effect, and conversations would be polished and honed to find the perfect rhythm and punchline. Many critics and audience members, captivated by his seemingly artless authenticity, took him to be a literal truth-teller. This assumption occasionally led to complications and hurt feelings, particularly for those who found themselves appearing as characters in his public narratives. This was a dynamic his former partner, Renee Shafransky, articulated with heartbreaking clarity. In a posthumous essay, she recalled how Spalding operated on a hierarchy of truth, where the artist's version of reality was the one that ultimately mattered. As she noted, he took what he needed from life and was always the hero of his own stories. This wasn't a simple accusation of lying, but rather a complex and nuanced observation about the inherent solipsism of the autobiographical artist. He wasn't necessarily deceiving his audience. He was simply presenting his subjective, artistically shaped version of reality as the definitive one. The truth of his work was not documentary, but emotional. The feelings were real, the anxieties were real, the existential dread was real, even if the specific events that illustrated them were filtered through the prism of performance and the demands of theatricality. He was telling his truth, not necessarily the truth. A second, more tragic controversy emerged in the wake of his death, one centered on the desperate medical journey he undertook in his final years. In the aftermath of the car accident, as he sank deeper into an intractable depression, he became fixated on the physical source of his torment. He believed, with an unshakable conviction, that the depressed skull fracture was the sole cause of his suffering, that a piece of his skull was literally pressing on his brain, causing the profound psychological changes he was experiencing. He desperately wanted a surgeon to perform a craniotomy, to go in and lift the bone, convinced that this physical intervention would magically restore him to his former self. This conviction placed his family and his doctors in an agonizing position. Most of the neurologists and psychiatrists who treated him advised strongly against such a high-risk procedure. They believed his condition was far more complex, a devastating combination of the diffuse neurological damage from the brain contusion, the psychological trauma of the event, and a possible genetic predisposition to depression. From their perspective, the surgery had little chance of success and carried a significant risk of making things worse, of causing infection, further brain damage, or even death. They saw his desire for the surgery as a form of magical thinking, a symptom of his brain injury and depression itself, a desperate longing for a simple mechanical fix for a wound that was psychic, spiritual, and cellular. However, Spalding, in his desperate search, did find one surgeon who was willing to consider the operation. This created a painful ethical debate and a division within his own family. Was his desire for the surgery a rational choice made by a man who knew his own mind better than anyone? Or was it a dangerously impulsive decision driven by a damaged brain that was no longer capable of sound medical reasoning? The question of patient autonomy versus medical paternalism is fraught in the best of circumstances. In the case of a patient with a traumatic brain injury, it becomes a nearly impossible dilemma. The surgery never happened, and the question of whether it might have helped or only hastened the end remains a source of unresolved pain and a subject of debate for those who loved him. It highlights the profound difficulty in treating traumatic brain injuries and the desperate, often fraught, search for answers when a mind begins to betray its owner. It is a debate with no easy answers, a testament to the brutal complexity of what happened to him in the final silent years of his life. Spalding Gray's ultimate legacy is twofold, encompassing both his artistic innovations and the tragic lessons of his final years. First and foremost, he is a seminal figure in the history of modern theater and performance art. He took the deeply personal and made it profoundly universal, proving that a single voice, a desk, and a glass of water could be just as theatrically compelling as a full-scale, multi-million-dollar production. He effectively dismantled the fourth wall, not with a gimmick, but with radical sincerity. He opened the door for a new generation of storytellers who work in the fertile ground between comedy, confession, and theater. Artists like Mike Birbiglia, who builds entire shows around his own embarrassing life events and medical woes, or Hassan Minhaj, who blends personal narrative with political commentary, are his direct creative descendants. The entire genre of modern autobiographical storytelling, from the spoken word poetry slam to wildly popular radio shows and podcasts like The Moth and This American Life, owes an enormous debt to the template he created. He legitimized the personal narrative as a valid and powerful form of public art, showing that our small, seemingly insignificant lives, with all their anxieties, absurdities, and sorrows, were worthy of a spotlight. Second, his life, and perhaps even more powerfully, his death, cast a long shadow over public conversations about mental health and traumatic brain injury. He was a man who seemed to possess the ultimate intellectual defense against depression, a profound self-awareness, and an unparalleled ability to articulate his every feeling and fear. His suicide was a devastating reminder that major depressive disorder is not a failure of character, a weakness of will, or a lack of insight. It can be a biological condition, a physical ailment as real and as deadly as cancer or heart disease. His story, especially its final chapter, became a tragic and high-profile case study in the devastating effects of a brain injury, showing with terrible clarity how a physical blow can completely and irrevocably alter a person's personality, mood, and capacity for hope. It forced a difficult conversation about the limits of therapy, the efficacy of medication, and the brutal reality that sometimes, despite the best efforts and intentions, the damage is simply too great to overcome. He spent his life trying to understand the ghost of his mother's suicide, only to become a ghost himself, a haunting figure who reminds us of the profound fragility of the human mind and the immense courage it takes for so many just to get through the day. He still matters because his work remains a timeless, hilarious, and heartbreaking map of the modern psyche, and his death remains a profound and tragic lesson in the limits of storytelling itself. In the end, Spalding Gray's life was a testament to the power and the ultimate failure of the narrative. He believed, or perhaps desperately needed to believe, that if he could just find the right words, if he could shape the chaos of his experience into a coherent, well-told story, he could control it. For many years, this belief system served him well. It made him a star, and in many ways, it kept him alive. He built a fortress of language around himself, and from within its walls, he bravely faced down his fears of death, madness, and mediocrity. But the car crash in Ireland was a brute force of reality that language could not tame. It was not a metaphor, it was not a story. It was a physical event that shattered the very tool he used to make sense of the world. The storyteller lost the plot. The final image of him on the Staten Island ferry is almost unbearably poetic. There he was, suspended between two shores, in the dark, cold water that had always been a recurring motif in his work, a symbol of the unconscious, of chaos, of the great unknown. He had spent his life swimming in those psychological waters, expertly navigating the currents of his own neuroses for a paying audience. But in the end, the tide was too strong. The man who talked his way through life chose a final act of utter silence. His story does not offer easy answers or a comforting moral. Instead, it leaves us with a deep and resonant sadness, a sense of profound loss for a singular, brilliant voice. It reminds us that our lives are a constant, fragile negotiation between the stories we tell ourselves and the unscripted, often brutal, realities we must face. Spalding Gray's tragedy was that for the first time in his life, he was faced with a pain for which he had no words, a final, terrible monster that he could not fit inside a box.